So welcome everyone to another edition of the OG Live Wire here in the GOAT District. Today is a really big day, I think, for a lot of us who are excited for the United States national team to go up against Iran in the World Cup. I am ecstatic. I talked a little bit last week, but I'm an American outlaw. It's like my team that I root for the most. So it's a very distracting day, but we got to grind our waivers. We got to get it in. This is a must-win week. We're 1 week away from By-Mageddon, and we have fantasy playoffs in a lot of formats. So let's go.
GOAT District, you know the Pope listens. Dynasty, our religion, for the blokes missing. On all of these trades, on all of these plays, on all of these grades. By the end of the day, y'all getting played. So what you gonna do next? Try to fill up that flex? Send the homie a text? That trash offer's the best? You try to make it complex, then they text you back. Now all of a sudden they don't make any sense. Broaden your horizons, boy. Dynasty's not for the Simons, boy. These trades not for consignment, boy. Respect your opponent, y'all some piranhas, boy. This my advice, from me to you. Open up your cute little podcast queue. Search up GOAT District, my dude. Pop it in your ear, man, y'all know what to do. It's the... And I always be traded. And I always be traded. And I always be trading. Y'all try to betray them, but first you gotta bait them. Fish.
So yeah, shout out to the chat. Appreciate the support. Harry Snowman in the house. So basically, this week is kind of, to me, it's a preparation week. There's not a lot of guys on the waiver wire. There's a few very intriguing additions we're going to talk about in a little bit, but I think this is a week to get yourself ready for week 14. Week 14 is an absolute mess. I don't know why they do bye weeks this late in the season. I guess if I was a team in playoff contention, it would be something that I would like to see, where I would get my team, a later in the year bye to kind of get ready for that for the NFL playoffs. But aside from that, I think it's something that should happen more towards the middle of the season. It's just crazy to have 6 teams coming up on bye. So this week we have no Arizona and no Carolina. I have a few teams where I have a number of Arizona players. It's going to be difficult to kind of navigate for a few leagues. Just having so many Arizona guys, just kind of the way that I drafted this year. I had a lot of Hollywood Brown, had a lot of DeAndre Hopkins, a good amount of James Conner, and a good amount of Kyler Murray. So that's going to be a little difficult. But week 14, you got to start getting yourself prepared. So Atlanta, Chicago, Green Bay, Indianapolis, New Orleans, and Washington are going to be on buys. Again, Atlanta, Chicago, Green Bay, Indianapolis, New Orleans, and Washington. I mean, that's ridiculous. You've got, Justin. Hopefully Justin Fields is back. He'll be out. You now have, Christian Watson looking like a weekly fantasy starter. Aaron Jones is an RB1. You have Jonathan Taylor, Michael Pittman, Chris Olave, Alvin Kamara. A lot of teams are using Antonio Gibson and certainly Terry McLaurin. So you've got a lot of teams that are going to be on buys. We've always talked about trying to be a week ahead. This week, you really want to be a week ahead on the bye week. So keep that in mind when you're setting your waivers this week. I think one easy solution is try not to keep the one-off position. So if you're using a kicker from one of those teams, I like to try to get that out of the way and make the switch now. It's one less thing for you to navigate next week. And it's one, you don't really want to be carrying a kicker with a bye week. And there's certainly not a kicker that's so impactful from any of those teams. In terms of defenses, you can probably let them go as well. So I know Washington has some decent matchups and they've had some good performances, but I think just breaking ties, you don't want to carry as many zeros that week. And again, your roster. So if you want to use Washington, like in those New York Giants matchups, by all means do so. But I think that you got to plan a week ahead. And in terms of this week, there's a few guys we want to go over. The quarterback position, again, you want to check your leagues because the quarterback position is just light this week on the waiver wire. Ryan Tannehill is the guy we've talked about before. He's now passed for 291 yards and 333 yards in his past 2 games. This is his 2 highest passing totals of the season. They've happened in consecutive weeks. We've seen Treylon Burks sort of come on. Derrick Henry is playing excellent football. I think that you've got to look at Ryan Tannehill as a potential streamer. He has a game in the fantasy playoffs against Houston. I believe it's week 16. If you're streaming QBs and you have a team that you think is a playoff type team, that's good enough for me to kind of keep them. So if I'm streaming, I'm looking at Ryan Tannehill. Mike White played fantastic last week. I had a chance to go to the game. It was very bad weather. It was raining the whole time. But Mike White passed for 315 yards and 3 touchdowns. New York dominated the Bears. He also had a huge game with Garrett Wilson. He hit Elijah Moore on a touchdown. The guy just played fantastic. So it was kind of crazy to watch him and think, how could you have started Zach Wilson over this guy? But they did. And I realize that the Bears defense is soft, but at the end of the day, is there any scenario where Zach Wilson would have put up 300 yards in the rain against that Bears defense? I mean, I don't see it happening. So at the end of the day, it was a soft defense, but he still produced. They play the Minnesota Vikings this week away. The game flow could be good enough that Mike White, has another nice performance. I think he's very good at targeting his running backs. He's shown that historically in his career. We're going to talk about some of those running back options in a little bit. Jordan Love looked good to me. Jordan Love came in for an injured Aaron Rodgers. He passed for 113 yards and a touchdown. We don't know where Rodgers is at injury-wise now. It was a rib injury, which is a weird one. Rib injuries, sometimes these guys play through it. Sometimes it keeps them out. I would anticipate with the bye week coming up, Jordan Love gets a start this week. They get to play against the same Bears defense that Mike White lit up. So Jordan Love suddenly goes into the streamer discussion. I think both White and Jordan Love, if you play Superflex or 2 QB formats, those 2 guys are guys I'm looking to plug in. Kenny Pickett, we saw him last night on Monday Night Football. He's a guy that has a couple of nice plus matchups coming up down the line. So he's one that I am, I'm still optimistic that he's going to have a couple of decent games down the stretch. I think that it's kind of like, let's get Kenny Pickett a little bit of momentum heading into next year. Pittsburgh doesn't have a whole lot to play for. And so I think that'll be kind of the focus, is to kind of get the young guys snaps and kind of build a little momentum to end the year. Running backs, there's some interesting ads this week. We saw Travis Etienne leave the game with a foot injury. Then we hear, and this was like gloom and doom, because I'm not watching Red Zone. I'm sitting at an NFL game, and I'm with my good friend of mine, and we both have Travis Etienne on a number of our teams. And we're just like, we see that he's leaving the game. Then you find out it's a foot injury, which has cost so many guys multiple games. It was just like, what is going on? Then you see the next day, Doug Marrone says that he could have put him back in. They were being cautious. I mean, it was like a gut punch. But sometimes coaches can be overly optimistic with their comments. Sometimes they can flat out lie. We're going to kind of see what injury distinction Travis Etienne has later in the week, whether he gets a questionable tag or something along those lines. But a guy that we've talked about on this show before, JaMycal Hasty, went ahead and stepped in, and he was very productive. Hasty had only 28 yards rushing. He's not a grinder, but he is a very talented receiving back. Shout out to Matt Kelly, the Podfather, a player profiler. He had a great tweet saying, Travis Etienne, his career high is 3 catches. JaMycal Hasty had 5 this past game. So if Hasty is given the start, I think he's going to be an RB2 based on how productive I think he'll be as a receiver. This past week, he had 5 catches for 67 yards. He added a touchdown and to go with the 28 yards rushing. We did not see Darrell Henderson active. So one thing to bear in mind is if Etienne were to miss, and again, it doesn't sound like he's going to, I think Henderson would see a great deal of the rushing role. I think Hasty would be kind of mixed in, and Hasty would do his damage through the air. So Hasty, I think a number of us already have rostered. Darrell Henderson is rostered in most of my leagues, but he's a guy worth checking on to see if he was dropped. I imagine he's going to be kept in most of the high stakes formats, but it's always worth taking a look. The guy that I'm really intrigued by is Zonovan Knight, Bam Knight. James Robinson was inactive, and people thought this would be a Michael Carter, Ty Johnson game, and Ty Johnson looked very good. Michael Carter got banged up, but Zonovan Knight was just like a breath of fresh air. He ran with like a ferocity, hitting the hole that the Jets kind of have lacked since Breece Hall went down. He had 103 combined yards. He looked pretty good as a receiver. He looked very good rushing the ball. Again, I think that the pessimistic argument against Knight is Michael Carter went out with an injury. Well, Michael Carter was limited and went out with an injury, so they really rode, Knight and a little more Ty Johnson. So you can take the pessimistic approach that Robinson was inactive, Michael Carter was hurt, so Knight got this role. But if those guys come back, they're going to go right ahead of him. The optimistic argument is Knight looked really good. He displayed a lot of juice, and I think that sometimes it's hard to put that back in the box. NFL coaches, can go back to, some coaches will never bench a guy because of injury, but Robinson and Carter have not done so much that, kind of riding the hot hand would not be the right approach. So I'm very excited about Zonovan Knight, and his opportunity there. I just think he looked very good. And I think that if you didn't get a chance to see the game, check it out on NFL Plus, or just check out Zonovan Knight's highlight reel. I mean, he really ran the ball well. I was impressed by him. And he certainly has fresh legs. So it's a guy that I'm interested in. Undrafted free agent. We've seen crazier things down the stretch in fantasy playoffs, and some of these running backs who kind of come out of nowhere end up being a starter for the 3-week fantasy gauntlet through the playoffs. So he's a guy that I'm prioritizing this week, and I'm hoping that my league mates are not really that excited about him and kind of look at him as a guy who made the most of his opportunity but is not a long-term guy. James Cook had a kind of a nothing game on Thanksgiving Day. He was a guy I was excited about last week. He had an 86 yards against Cleveland. And then on the short week in a very close game, that Detroit-Buffalo game on Thanksgiving was really, really fun. In a very close game, they rode Devin Singletary. So Cook is still a guy that I like to roster when possible, because I think that if Singletary were to miss time, Cook would be really, really effective. And we love that Buffalo offense. Quick check-in on the comments in the chat. Shout out to 1912. Shout out to Jose Pena. Jose, any defense you like for the fantasy playoffs? Kansas City gets Denver. That's one that I would look at. Let me pull up. I'll have my couple of defenses. It's kind of tough because I think that some people need wins this week. So again, I think that the Steelers defense is pretty interesting for this week. But I'm looking at the Chiefs defense because they have that week 14 game against the Broncos. And this week they might get cut because they're playing Cincinnati. So that's a team I would be looking at for the playoffs. I think Kansas City has a few nice matchups down the stretch. That's one I would look to pick up. But that's something that I didn't really dive into. I don't really do too many defensive recommendations. Maybe next week we'll get into that a little bit more. Getting back to the running backs, Dontrell Hilliard, Kenneth Gainwell, Matt Breida, those are guys that we should roster, whenever possible. Samaje Perine was scooped up everywhere, obviously, because of the Joe Mixon injury. He was a guy that we talked about a lot on the show. But it just goes to show you, when these backup running backs with receiving ability take over the job, they usually produce like RB2s or higher. Some teams are different than others where, there'll be more of a committee. And certainly I don't think, Dontrell Hilliard would be a guy that would get, 25 touches in a close game by any means. But just having the receiving ability as a handcuff, it makes you very appealing. We really like those guys, Dontrell Hilliard, Kenneth Gainwell, and to an extent, Matt Breida, just because of how reliant I think New York would have to be on him. There was an argument for Gary Brightwell. I just think Breida's a little bit better as a receiver, so he would be my preferred handcuff to Saquon. And then the interesting outcome of last night's game was Najee Harris's injury. BENNiE SNELL stepped in, and had a Benny Snell type game. He falls forward, he doesn't fumble. He's kind of a guy that Mike Tomlin's kept around on the roster for years. He's a slower running back. He's a guy that people are going to add this week because I think that a lot of people kept Jaylen Warren through the injury. So I think Benny Snell is going to be a popular addition. But Jaylen Warren could end up being, I don't want to call him a league winner based on, the Steelers offense is not, a top 10 offense or anything like that. But I think Jaylen Warren, if he had an opportunity to play a full-time role based on his explosiveness, his receiving ability, his ability to run the ball, I think Jaylen Warren to me would be somewhere around RB18. I think he'd be a mid-level RB2 for me. So Jaylen Warren, hopefully you did not cut him. He was a guy that when he got injured, I was going to cut him in a few places. I ended up not cutting him. I'll give a hat tip to Dan Williamson, who was pretty optimistic that it was going to be a nothing kind of injury, and also Mike Tomlin for being kind of honest, saying that Warren was pretty close to playing. So hat tip to I hope Mike Tomlin is listening, and I'm sure Dan Williamson will listen at some point. So always a hat tip to the overhyped sleeper, one of the sharper guys I know in basically anywhere in fantasy football. So we kept Jaylen Warren on our teams, and I kept Jaylen Warren on my other teams. So I'm glad I did so, because it would be just awful to miss out on the opportunity after rostering him for so long. Mike Boone is another name. He's set to come off of IR. He was seeing the receiving role out of the Denver backfield before he got injured. Again, Denver is just an absolute mess. They're a terrible offense, a terrible team, a terrible coach. But at the end of the day, Mike Boone could have a decent role down the stretch. And then we got to talk about the San Francisco running backs. Jordan Mason had 5 rushes for 25 yards. He stepped up when Elijah Mitchell went down. Elijah Mitchell is going to miss what sounds like the rest of the season. He's just had terrible luck this year. Elijah Mitchell gets injured at the beginning of the season. I think he was set to have a nice role on the team. Then he comes back. He immediately gets playing time. And then he gets injured again. So it's just been a really unfortunate. I think this is the 3rd big injury for Elijah Mitchell now. He had corrective surgery last offseason and then 2 injuries this season. So it's tough for Elijah Mitchell. I think that, it's really tough for these young running backs to come back from multiple injuries. He was a guy we liked in the GOAT district, but I think it's a guy that, most people cashed out on this year in Dynasty, hopefully off of his rookie season. And if you did manage to hold him, the CMC trade just killed his value anyway. So he's done. Jordan Mason, I think, is kind of like the low-hanging fruit. I think people will go add him. But to me, Tyrion Davis-Price is the one I would prefer to add. When Davis-Price went down, he was well ahead of Mason. He was active, and he was getting double-digit carries. He's a guy that they took on day 2 this year. So I would prioritize Tyrion Davis-Price over Jordan Mason. I wouldn't go breaking the bank on either. Again, CMC is there. CMC complained about, I think it was knee tightness or something. They kept him out of a couple of 2-minute drill drives last game, which was odd. But I don't think it's anything serious. But at the end of the day, we want to have the handcuff running backs. So I would bet on Tyrion Davis-Price. If you think I'm wrong, go for Jordan Mason. One of them will have value as the handcuff running back to CMC. Wide receivers, we have a bunch of interesting players. If I needed a spot start this week, I would look at Mac Hollins. Mac Hollins is kind of like the boring veteran play this week. He's going to be available in a lot of leagues. He has had 5 games with 6 or more targets, and he's had 3 games over 52 yards receiving post-bye week. He's nothing special, but he's a solid bet for double-digit PPR points this week. I think he can get you, 10-plus points, get you through a jam, and then he's an interesting guy that you might have to use again next week. With all these teams on buys. Again, he's a very boring play, but we're just talking about a floor play, and that would be Hollins. If you want to go for a ceiling play, a guy that we've encouraged you to add, I think he's pretty much rostered in all the high-stakes formats now, is Sky Moore, but he's available in a lot of home leagues still. He's had 5 catches in back-to-back games. He's had 6 targets in back-to-back games. This past week, he only had 36 yards receiving, but he's seeing his role grow. Kadarius Toney could come back. I don't think he will, but he could. So that would obviously hurt Sky Moore. But I think that, Sky Moore becoming a thing is something that could take Kansas City's offense to, an even more dangerous place because he's explosive. He was their second-round draft pick. He also has the ability to rush the football. We're talking about doing designed wide receiver runs for him in the preseason, sort of like what they did for Tyreek Hill. He's certainly not Tyreek Hill, but he can, make plays, running the ball. I believe he was a high school quarterback. So these guys still I'm very intrigued with. Van Jefferson. Van Jefferson looks like the wide receiver one in Los Angeles. It is just an ugly scene for the Rams. They can't do anything. You've got Cooper Kupp on the IR. Allen Robinson's now done for the season. Jefferson saw 7 targets this past Sunday. He caught 3 for 29 yards and a touchdown. He's had at least 5 targets in 3 of his 4 games after returning from injury. I think 5 targets will be his floor. These won't be great targets, but I think that he's going to get 5+ targets every single game. Sometimes when these guys get moved to a wide receiver 1 role, they'll end up with a 9 or 10 target game. It just happens. So, Van Jefferson would be a guy that I would look to roster. I think it's just tough to roster any Ram right now, but he would be the one based on, how they really didn't use Higbee last week, which was very surprising that they, used Higbee as like an offensive lineman in a game where I thought Higbee was going to see an outsized role and it just didn't happen. So it looks like Van Jefferson would be one to add. We're still on Odell Beckham watch. It sounds like the Cowboys and Giants are the 2 most logical landing spots. This week, he had like a weird off-field incident where he was escorted off of a plane. I don't know a whole lot about it. The police escorted him off. I think that he was like unresponsive to the flight crew, and they thought he was like in and out of consciousness. It was very odd, but I don't think it was anything that's going to keep him from signing with an NFL team. Certainly there was no criminality or anything like that. It was super weird, but that's that. So Odell, sounds like the Cowboys or the Giants. The Cowboys would give him a better offense. The Giants would give him a higher target share. I would much prefer to see him sign with the Giants. If he signs with the Giants, I think that he could potentially be the wide receiver 1 there. As crazy as it sounds, you never know the way what the promises are made. I think that he could see, some high value looks, and he could be a big part of that offense. Again, it's Darius Slayton, who we've told you to add for weeks and weeks, and now he's having a very, very solid run. I think he's safely in the wide receiver 3 line. But we've also told you to add Richie James. Richie James, I think, would see a potential decrease in targets if Odell signs with them. But right now we need to assume Odell's not going to be a Giant. And if Richie James is still available, I would look to add him. He's filling in for Wan'Dale Robinson. He's getting the slot looks. He caught 5 passes for 42 yards and a touchdown. His 6 targets tied for the team lead. And I think that he'll see a similar target share every single week. The Giants, again, are very limited in their offensive weapons, so Richie James could kind of get us through a pinch. Devontae Parker had 4 catches for 80 yards against Minnesota. This was his 2nd highest yardage total of the season. The New England wide receiver core is banged up. Jacoby Myers is banged up. Nelson Aguilar is banged up. So Devontae Parker could see a kind of a larger role. And then Corey Davis, Elijah Moore. Elijah Moore to me is not going to be available in most leagues because I use a lower threshold. He'll be available to you in a lot of home leagues. And I think that he definitely shows promise now that he linked up with Mike White. But I'm assuming that Elijah Moore is not available to you in FFWC and FFC leagues because people just, couldn't cut him based on, what would happen if there was a QB change. And they were right to do so because he looked extremely explosive on his touchdown catch. But the jet that could be available is Corey Davis. Corey Davis saw a ton of playing time. He out-snapped Moore. He was, out on the field in 2 wide receiver sets. And he stepped into, pretty normal role for him based on where he was in that Jets offense when he got injured. He has had 3 games with 74 or more yards during the season. I think that Davis is going to be on the field a lot, and we are kind of optimistic for Mike White. So Davis is a guy you can get really, really cheap because he didn't really do anything this past weekend. But he's one that I'm holding on to just to see kind of what happens from there. Checking back in on the chat. Yeah, shout out to 1912. This is my U.S. men's national team scarf. I'm tripling up on the scarf today. Shout out to ML talking about that Kansas City defense. Yeah, they get Houston, they get Denver, and then they get a Seattle team which can do some damage, but I think Kansas City will put a lot of pressure on them to keep up score-wise, and that could lead to turnovers. Shout out to Matt Leahy, Rachaad White, or Jamal Williams for this week. I'm still on Rachaad White. I think Rachaad White is going to be a guy that I want to get in my lineup. Jamal Williams has found a way to get in the end zone almost every week, but he's very touchdown dependent. I think White is just in a better situation. We talked about shout out to Michael Melberg. I don't know what's going on with Higbee. It's super, super weird. Shout out to Blurpy. Who would you rather have rest of the season? Mike Evans, Chris Olave, or Deebo Samuel? That's a tough one. Deebo's at like 13 points per game right now. He's a guy that we're going to talk about tonight. We have a high-stakes roundtable with Glenn Lowy and Adam Krautwurst, two really, really good high-stakes players. Glenn's a big NFFC guy. In my opinion, he's probably the next person that the NFFC puts in their Hall of Fame. And Adam Krautwurst, a friend of ours from Draft Sharks, who's a really, really good FFPC player, also does other formats, but he's known for his work in the FFPC. We're going to have another high-stakes roundtable with those guys tonight. And Deebo's one we're going to talk about. But for me, gosh, it's a super tough one. Evans is probably the answer, but I'm going to go Chris Olave. I just think Olave down the stretch could have a couple of big games. I like those younger wide receivers in the fantasy playoffs. I just think that he's due for a big one. I think that he could tilt a week for me. ML says Evans, it would be his choice. Yeah, I mean, ML is probably correct on that. I'm a sucker for Olave. Shout out to Scott Kobe. Could Jordan Mason be the best back to pick up on the waiver wire this week? Yeah, I mean, if we're pessimistic on the CMC injury, which I'm not necessarily, then one of these San Francisco running backs is the one to roster. But I keep going back to Tyrion Davis-Price and how he was ahead of Jordan Mason before TDP was lost for injury. So I still really like TDP, but I think that both him and Mason are good additions this week, just based on what could be. Shout out to 1912's feelings on Michael Gallup. I like Gallup. I like Gallup right now. I wonder what an Odell Beckham signing would do with Gallup. I think he might lose a target or so. Again, Schultz gets his targets, and you could throw Ferguson with him. Let's say that the tight end position gets targets from Dak. CeeDee Lamb is on a tear. Gallup obviously has his role. If you introduce another wide receiver in the mix, I don't know if that really helps him so much. But again, Gallup is a guy I like. I always really like the talent. So getting back to it, the tight end position, I mean, we could not talk tight ends at all today, and it would be, I don't think anybody would complain, but Jordan Akins, he had led Houston with 5 catches for 61 yards. He now has 3 games with 61 yards or more in his last 6 games played. Again, if you think about that, he's had 61 yards or more in 3 out of his last 6 games. For the tight end position, that's not bad. It's very difficult to use him, but again, if you're desperate, he's there, especially for tight end premium leagues. Hunter Henry had 3 catches for 63 yards, and he nearly had a second touch. He had a touchdown catch, but he nearly had a second touchdown catch that was overturned. He's a difficult player to rely on, but I think he could see a bigger role due to the injuries at wide receiver. And then Austin Hooper, he's had 3 straight games with 4 or more targets. He's a touchdown dependent low end tight end too. It's ugly. So anyway, shout out to the chat. It's was a really good one today. Really appreciate you guys. I hope you guys all are going to make some cash this year, and I hope that you guys are all in the fantasy playoffs. Again, tune in later tonight, 9 p.m. this evening. We have Adam Krautwurst of Draft Sharks and Glenn Lowy, known for the NFFC. 2 great high-stakes players. Also 2 New York guys. I say Glenn Lowy is probably the best fantasy football player on Long Island, where I live. I'm in too many leagues with Glenn over the years and competed against him too many times. And Adam is a known guy up in the Buffalo area. So those guys are tremendous guests. We've had excellent high-stakes roundtables. I think tonight will not be different. And again, we're going to be back on Wednesday night with Darren Armani, Fantasy Mojo, to kind of go over some of the hits of the year, some of the best possible draft picks, some of the players that are appearing on the most playoff rosters, some of the biggest waiver wire pickups of the year based on how their teams did making the playoffs. It's always a fun one when Darren's on in the district. We all love Fantasy Mojo, so that'll be a fun one. So tune in later tonight at 9. Thanks again. Go U.S. men's national team. 2-0 U.S. men's national team. We score one in the first half. We open them up. We get a second, and we go on, and we get out of the group, and it's going to be an awesome day. Take care.